Hello, my name is Shadow Retro, and today I will be doing a tutorial video on the basics of damage. Basically, a 101 damage class, and one of your first classes into college. You're a bright-eyed new student wanting to learn about the magical game of Warframe, and this is your introduction to the basic games, the basic damage system. Nailed it. So the purpose of this video will be for newer players who are basically going through the base start chart and still struggling through the new game and have maybe reached a point around about like Saturn or Uranus where they're starting to see that the enemies are getting harder and they don't really know how to mod or do anything that is able to kill them. I know I was there at one point when I started playing this game many years ago. So this video will be hopefully to teach you the very core basics of damaging in Warframe. This video will not go into detail about the advanced damage strats such as meta options and other strategies in the game that are used in the late game. I will be making a video later on that will basically be how to damage advanced, and I'll probably break it up into a melee video and another video for primary and secondary weapons because they work a bit differently. So do wait patiently for those when they'll come out. They won't be long. They'll be the next few videos to be released basically. So this video is just for the basics, which will basically be a prerequisite for the next videos that I will be released. So let's get right into it. For making a successful weapon in Warframe, there are certain stats that you want to be concerned with. The first one and the easiest to explain is fire rate. Simply put, fire rate will increase the speed of which your weapon fires. If you have a higher fire rate, that will directly result in having a higher DPS, as you'll shoot faster, basically, right? So your DPS will be increased by increasing fire rate. Melees don't have fire rate because they don't shoot a bullet, but instead they have attack speed, which is basically the same stat, it's just called something different. Next up, we have critical shots. In Warframe, there is a critical shot system that is affected by both critical chance and critical multiplier. Let's break into critical multiplier first. The critical multiplier is how much extra damage you'll be getting when you shoot an enemy. For this weapon, for example, I have a 5.6 times critical multiplier. That means when I have a critical shot, the damage I'll be doing will be multiplied by 5.6. So we get that extra damage. Pretty simple to understand, right? So that is just a simple and easy way to straight up multiply your damage output by getting a critical hit. Critical chance is the actual chance that you have to get a critical shot. As you see on this weapon, I have a 105% critical chance, meaning I am guaranteed a critical shot with every single one of my hits, so I'm always benefiting from that 5.6 times multiplier. Critical chance can actually go above 100% and into 200%, 300%, 400%, even higher. Because of this, there are multiple tiers with critical damage. The first tier, or called a yellow crit, is simply just going to apply the crit multiplier once. But it can go higher. You can get a second tier crit or an orange crit, which will apply the critical multiplier even more. It's not a straight double, so a tier 2 crit on this weapon won't give me a 11.2 critical times multiplier. There is an equation that goes into it, so it isn't just a straight double, but it is still going to be like a critical multiplier of like 10 times or something. Then you can get a tier 3 and the critical multiplier goes up even more. Tier 4, it goes up even more. I believe tiers can go all the way up to tier 10, but you're unlikely to see that. When you go up in crit hits, your damage numbers actually change. Normal shots will just be white, non-crit shots. Yellow crits or tier 1 crits, your damage numbers will be yellow, hence why they're called yellow crits. Orange crits, yes, you guessed it, the damage numbers will be orange. And a red crit, which is a tier 3 crit or higher, will have red damage numbers. So if you ever see anyone say red crit or like juicy red crits or something like that, that's what they're referring to, a tier 3 or higher critical shot. And you can have status chances ranging from below 100%, where you won't get a guaranteed yellow crit, or you can have status chances even higher, where you get a guaranteed orange or red crit every single shot. The next thing that we want to talk about is status chance. Now, in Warframe, there are 13 damage types, which we will be going into more detail in a second. These damage types have status effects, which again we'll be going into more detail in a second. Basically though, this stat here, the status chance stat, is how much chance you have to apply a status from one of the damage types your weapon does. Pretty simply put. And status chances do a bunch of different things depending on what damage types we're talking. Like I said, there's 13 main damage types, and each one has a unique status effect. But if you have a 41% status chance, like I do, that means each time one of my bullets hits an enemy, there is a 41% chance for that bullet to apply a random status effect from one of the damage types my weapon does. You can have a 100% status chance where you're always guaranteed a status proc, and you can have even more than 100% where you'll be applying multiple status procs on one shot. And then we have our base damage. The damage types in the game are broken into 3 categories. You have your IPS damage types, which are often also referred to as your physical damage types, which are called impact, puncture, and slash. IPS, the 3 that are right here, impact, puncture, slash. And then you have your element damage types, which are then broken up into 2 categories. You have your primary elements, which are toxic, electricity, heat, and cold. And then you have your secondary elements, which there are 6. Secondary elements are formed by mixing primary elements together. For example, toxic and cold mix together to create viral. Then you also have blast, which comes from cold heat, corrosive, which comes from toxic and electricity, gas, which comes from toxic and heat, magnetic, which is electric and cold, and finally radiation, which is electric and heat. So those are your 13 damage types. Each damage type will be either effective, neutral, or weak to different enemy health types. Each different enemy faction in the game has a list of different health types that will have some resistance and some weaknesses to different enemy health to different damage types. For example, corrosive will deal more damage to enemies that have ferrite armor, which is a very common health type for Grineer enemies. Or magnetic does more damage against shields, which of course Corpus units have. But I will go into more detail about basically what damage types you want in different circumstances in my How to Damage Advanced video. Additionally, all the damage types, every single one of them, separate from their raw damage factors, have a status effect that then does something completely separate to what they do as a raw damage. The raw damage factors, depending on if they're strong or weak against different health types, determine on how much damage your weapon will actually be doing with raw damage, basically. Where the status effect that each of the damage types have only affect the enemies if you proc that status effect. So it depends on the status chance of your weapon, basically. Now, each damage type has a different status effects, and they range between many different things. There are multiple different damage over time, or DOT status effects, such as heat, toxic, slash, and there are some status effects that debuff enemies, such as magnetic and viral, and there are even some status effects that will crowd control enemies, making it so they won't attack you as much, such as radiation or blast. Then we have our base damage. The base damage is just, if you were to put on Suration on a Warframe, the base damage would go up, just like that. Base damage will affect the amount of damage that the individual damage types of your weapon does. Again, as I give an example, my base damage goes up. Each damage type here acts as a percentage of the base damage. So by increasing the base damage, you also then increase the extra damage you have here. IPS damages are different, as if you have a weapon like the Torrid that doesn't have any IPS damage, adding a mod that will increase your IPS damage, such as Sawtooth Clip, will not give you slash. You cannot give yourself slash, impact, or puncture if it doesn't have it. However, using a mod that gives one of the elemental damage types will always add it. So I can add heat to this build, which will give me gas since my Torrid already does toxic as a base. Or I can then add another element like cold, and then the weapon will then be doing blast, and toxic damage, as the heat and the cold together will combine to create blast, and then left over will be the inherent toxic damage we have from our weapon. It's important to note that there is an order of priority with mods, starting here and then going from left to right, and then on the second row again left to right. So if you have multiple mods that do different damage types, they will mix in this order. For example, I now have radiation and viral. That's because the toxic here is mixing with the heat here, and then the cold here is mixing with the toxic here, as that's the order of the mods in the circums: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I can then instead change that to give myself gas and magnetic by simply just swapping these two mods. Now toxic happens first, and it will mix with the next element that it finds in the trap, which happens to be heat, which gives us gas. Then we get cold, which will mix in with the next element we find in the trap, which is electricity, giving us magnetic. We can replace these two mods, which will give us viral and radiation again. Or we can replace these mods, which will give us corrosive and blast. Lastly, we have something called faction damage. Faction damage do not show up in your modding screen like here. Basically, they're just an additional damage buff to a specific faction, like damage to Grenadier. There are mods like this for every single faction: Corpus, Corrupted, Murmur, Infested, and Grenadier, the 5 factions. The way you would mod your weapon when you're first starting off and learning the basics of how to damage in Warframe is you basically want to look at your weapon and you want to see its potential for critical chance and status chance and crit multiplier. If you're looking at a weapon that has around 25% crit chance or 25% status chance, that's a pretty good status/crit chance. 20 is more of like the baseline, more average range. Meanwhile, for a critical multiplier, 2 times critical multiplier is like the baseline. So a 3 times critical multiplier, for example, is really good. A 2.5 will also be really good. Basically, you want to look at these stats and you want to buff them. You want to add mods like critical delay to increase your critical chance, so you have more critical shots. Then you want to add mods like critical damage to have more critical damage, so you buff your shots even more, and these things will buff your damage output. Starting on earlier in the new game, status chance might not be as important for you as you go through the base star charts, so I would recommend focusing on more stuff like your critical chance, critical damage, your fire rate, and then your base damage, such as adding serration onto your weapons. And then the last stat that you need to worry about is something called Multishot. Multishot is a very interesting stat in this game, and it's the specific reason why I left it for last. Basically, unless said otherwise, most weapons in the game shoot one bullet or one projectile whenever they fire. Adding Multishot onto a weapon will increase the amount of shots it fires. So for example, this weapon has a Multishot of 1.8. That means it will always shoot one pallet, but it has an 80% chance to shoot a second pallet. This second pallet would not go to my magazine count, so I can shoot out 2 bullets, but only count as one shot. Each bullet acts as an independent damage source, so you basically double your damage. Each bullet then can independently have a critical chance. So with this weapon, I have above 100% critical chance, so both bullets will be having a guaranteed critical shot, meaning both bullets will then independently have the critical multiplier applied to them. And each bullet independently can apply critical status procs. So if you have a weapon with more than 100% status chance and say a 2 multi-shot, you will be applying a guaranteed 2 status procs each time you fire the weapon, because each pellet that you fire will apply status effects independently from one another. So basically, the more multi-shot you have, the more damage you do. It will greatly improve your damage massively, and is probably the most important damage multiplier that you can ever worry about. If you don't have multi-shot, you're doing something wrong. So again, when you're new to the game and you want to figure out how you mod, you want to have your critical chance, your multi-shot, potentially your fire rate, If your weapon is a bit slow, if your weapon fires pretty good, you might not want fire rate, depends on how you want to mod, but fire rate is also really good. And then you just want your raw damage, like serration. You might want to put on corrosive as well, as corrosive is a very good damage type for raw damage. And then just that enough should be more than enough, more than all you need to go through the base star chart with relative ease. Damaging and the way it works gets a lot more complicated as we start going into higher level content such as Steel Path, which is why I want to make a separate video on it, and why I want to make two different videos, one for melee weapons and then the other one for ranged weapons, primaries and secondaries. For example, as they do act differently, and melee weapons have different mods, for example, and they have slightly different strategies. For example, melee weapons aren't affected by Multishot. Melee weapons also have something called attack speed and not fire rate, which I also discussed. But besides that, every other stat that I've discussed here do apply to melee weapons the exact same as they apply to primary and secondaries. You have critical chance, critical multiplier, status chance, base damage, all of that on your melee weapons as well. Anyway, I do hope this video was informative for you, and I hope I gave you enough information for some of you new players trying to make your way through the star chart and trying to understand the basics of how damage works in this game. So, if you did learn something from this video, and if you did like this video, please consider giving me a like and checking out some of my other videos, which would be quite cool. I have some Warframe build guide videos already out for a few different Warframes. So if you're interested in one of those Warframes, do check that out, and you might learn something from those videos as well. And of course, leave a comment of telling me if you found this video helpful, or if you're telling me if you think I missed out any other information that would be important for a new player to know. And then until next time, goodbye.